Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. You guys are so dead. Wake up. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. We'll try it again. Happy Thanksgiving. Oh, that was so much better. So much better. Oh, my goodness. Did you realize, and I just figured this out yesterday, actually, that we are nearly 400 years into celebrating Thanksgiving? Did you know that? Isn't that kind of cool? 2021 will be the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. I think that's kind of cool. In fact, I want to share with you a little bit about the history of Thanksgiving in case you don't know it. Now, some of you are history buffs and you're just going to love this. Others of you are going to go to sleep for the next 3 minutes. And so I'll wake you up. I'll try to wake you up and remember to do that. But the first Thanksgiving was 1621 in Plymouth, Plymouth, Massachusetts. There we go. I know my geography, right? Plymouth, Massachusetts. And it started with the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower a year earlier in September of 1620. And there were 102 of them. Now think about this. 102 of them made a 66-day journey across the Atlantic Ocean, and 50% didn't survive. 50%. I mean, consider that. And then they got into this new world almost at the start of wintertime, and they didn't know how to survive. And if it weren't for a Pawtuxet Native American Indian named Squanto who came and taught them how to grow corn and get sap from trees and how to fish and how to avoid poisonous plants, they wouldn't have survived at all. And so it was in that first kind of after the harvest of 1621 that they celebrated the very first Thanksgiving. And it was led by William Bradford, who was the head of the colony. In fact, I got a picture, I think, up here of William Bradford. Maybe. Picture of William Bradford. So there we go. Oh, it's coming. There you go. Yeah, William Bradford, and he was the leader of the colony, and they got to celebrate their very first Thanksgiving. And then in 1789, George Washington, our first president, made an official proclamation for the United States of America that we would celebrate Thanksgiving. That continued till Thomas Jefferson became president. He didn't want it. He thought it was a kingly practice. And then there's a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale who wrote a song you're probably familiar with, Mary Had a Little Lamb. You heard of that one? She made it her mission to get the country to celebrate Thanksgiving, and it took her 36 years to convince everyone that this was a good idea. And it was Abraham Lincoln at the height of the Civil War who finally gave in, and he in 1863 said this. He said, ask God to commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation. And he was kind of the one who restarted it at the prompting of Sarah Josepha Hale. And then Thanksgiving's kind of continued on since then. In 1924, we had the very first Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade with this cool float of Humpty Dumpty. I don't know if it's going to come up there. There you go. Humpty Dumpty from 1924. Times have changed, right? There are no Pokemon floats in that one. And then in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he messed up everything, and it was at the height of the Great Depression, and he wanted the retail stores to have an extra week to be able to sell their stuff for Christmas. So he moved Thanksgiving up a week. It had been the last Thursday of November, and it met all kinds of drama from our country. People were furious at him for doing this. The movie Holiday Inn, if you've ever seen the movie Holiday Inn, they made fun of it, and this is kind of a picture of the video where the turkey was jumping from Thursday to Thursday. Little known movie fact. That's what they're doing there. And it was in 1941 that FDR caved to the immense pressure and set Thanksgiving to be the fourth Thursday of November, at which it has been since then. There you go. There's your history of Thanksgiving, all right? Yeah. All right, so those of you who were away or asleep, now you can wake up. But here's the thing, no other country celebrates Thanksgiving the way we celebrate it. We've been talking about that over the last month in this series, Be Grateful. And the truth is, the United States, we kind of started it. It's kind of our deal. And other countries have harvest festivals, but it doesn't go the same way. And then there's some expatriates from the U.S. who've gone to other countries who've tried to start Thanksgiving. And so there are mini Thanksgiving celebrations. But we in America, we just really know how to celebrate Thanksgiving because we have so much to be thankful for. You think about our country being the richest, wealthiest, most prosperous nation in the history of the world. We just have a lot to be thankful for. In fact, we sent you home with jars the very first week of the series, and there are some jars over there you can grab. And we had a big jar where people could drop in things that they're thankful for. And I just wanted to kind of share some of these things just as a reminder of we do have a lot to be thankful for. Here's one, phones. Who doesn't love technology, right? Other ages didn't get to experience that, at least the way we did. I guess the wheel was technology when it was invented. For God, that's another good one. Thankful for a church where I can worship God. for the church's great children's program, so our son can grow spiritually through God, that the workers are fantastic and our son is excited about what he's learning. Indoor plumbing. Last night around our dinner table, I told my daughter, Noelle, I know something you're thankful for. It's a stool, right? Because she gets to step up on the stool. We forget, little things. Church that knows that our community needs hope. Puppies. I still like that one, even though I don't have one. Freedom to worship. I'm not bitter. Freedom to worship without fear. That's, we forget. Our country, as many problems as the United States exists, I think we'd all agree we'd rather live here than North Korea, right? There are lots of great things about this. For a supportive family, that God's always at work, even when we don't see it. Thankful the church feels like family, my family, lots of things. Family is a big one. Work, jobs, the freedom that we have when we have jobs and when we have work. All of the many blessings, the best health care. Aren't you glad that we don't have leeches to bleed us out when we have medical issues? I mean, we have the best medical care in the world. We have so very much to be thankful for. And do you know what the common thread is in all of these things? They're all things that we don't deserve. They're all things that we don't earn, but they enrich our lives. That's what leads us to gratitude. In fact, we could say gratitude comes when our lives are undeservedly enriched. They're things that we can't earn. They're simply given to us. It's just our privilege of receiving them. When you work, you expect to be paid. When you get your paycheck, you're not necessarily grateful for your paycheck because, maybe you are grateful for it, but it's owed to you. And so there's this sense of entitlement. There's this sense of, this belongs to me. And that's actually, I would argue, the problem with our culture right now and the problem with our country is that we have so much, that our prosperity has led us to so much, that as our prosperity increases, our gratitude decreases. As we become feeling entitled, like I am owed this, I deserve this is just my right. Every American should have a phone. Every American should be able to take vacation. We should all have these things. And so when we begin believing that it's owed to us, our gratitude disappears and it moves away, and then we become critical. Isn't it interesting that in a culture that has so much, we are like the chief of complainers in America? Look at social media. For Pete's sake, social media is just all about being critical and complaining, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. Look at the news cycles. It's all about everything wrong and complaints and criticism. We just focus so much on the negative. And you know what the problem is? That we drag other people into our negativity. We drag other people in. I drag other people in because I've got a big mouth, right? And I like to share what I'm frustrated with, and that's not a good thing. Do you know why? Because complaining is contagious. Complaining is absolutely contagious. You could be having a perfectly great day. In fact, as I was listing all those things that we're thankful for, that you're thankful for, my guess is you were starting to think about, man, those are wonderful things. But then, let's talk about the things that we have to complain about. Let's talk about the government. Good grief. Who is tired of tweeting and Russia and impeachment and, yada, yada, yada? Who's tired of all that stuff? I could complain about the government all day long. Who's frustrated with our health care and how expensive it is and all that good stuff? We can think about all the irritating things with family and our relationships and how our kids or spouse didn't do this or the people we care. There's so many things that we could find ourselves complaining about, and it's amazing how quickly our attitude of gratitude shifts because of contagious complaining. It shifts in the direction of being frustrated and annoyed. And there's no shortage of things that we as a people, we love to complain about. And I'm not pointing my finger at you. I'm pointing my fingers at me. We're so good at it, and it's so contagious, and a good day can turn into a bad one when we're around complaints. We're generous. And our complaining infects other people. And here's kind of my bottom line for today, and this is really where we're talking about and why it's so important that our complaining infects other people, and it moves us all in a direction away from God. That our complaining moves us in a direction away from God because it is so contagious, it infects other people, and it affects us in a significant way. And in the process of complaining, we move away from the very thing that God has given to us. Part of the reason why I asked Josh to lead the song Abundantly More is because God has given us so much. And yet as a society, we find so many things to complain about. Now, it's probably not surprising to find out that Jesus had all kinds of people complaining about him. I think it's actually kind of funny that he's the Son of God and people complained about him. Really, he's the Son of God and people complained about him. So if anybody ever complains about you, you should just know that even a perfect person was complained about, okay? People got frustrated with Jesus and annoyed and irritated with him. And there were particularly two groups of people who really complained about him, and we're going to talk about them a little bit today. They were known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and it seemed like no matter what Jesus did, they just complained about him. In fact, when you look at their interactions with him, they had this amazing opportunity in front of them. Really, think about it. They had the Son of God in their presence, and they complained him away. And they held secret meetings, and they ultimately crucified him. That's the direction that complaining can take people. It took groups of people there 2,000 years ago. And they missed what God was doing. And everywhere Jesus would show up, the Pharisees and the Sadducees would follow him around, and they'd start complaining about things, and they were frustrated that he was moving people toward God, and they started getting irritated with it, and he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do. So they start complaining, trying to trip him up and trap him up. There's one particular occasion where they asked Jesus for a sign. Now, keep in mind that Jesus had just fed 5,000 people, and he had fed 4,000 people. We talked about the 5,000 last week in this series, and then he had also fed 4,000 people, and he's like, look, I've given you signs. You're not getting any more signs. You know what the sign for you is going to be? He says, the sign for you is going to be the sign of Jonah. Now, Jonah, you may know, was in the belly of a whale for 3 days, and then he was spit back on dry ground. And so Jesus is looking at them and saying, look, that's going to be your sign. When I die and come back to life 3 days later, that's how you're going to know I am who I said I am. That's your sign. And he was probably a little bit frustrated and irritated with them. And he took his disciples, they got on a boat, and they left this area where the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up a story here I want to take a look at from the book of Matthew. Chapter 16, we'll be there in just a second. But I just want to say this, as I'm going through this story, you may be tempted to think, where is he going with this? This doesn't really connect, but I promise it will at the end. It's all going to make sense. And I think there's a huge lesson that is so important for us as it comes to our heart attitude and what God wants to do in us and give to us, and our gratitude and how it links together. So Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 5, we read, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. So I don't know exactly how this was playing out. It could be that they're kind of talking amongst themselves and like, hey, did you bring the bread? No, I forgot the bread. It's like going on a camping trip and you forgot the supplies, right? They were away from a place where they could get them. They're talking about it. And I think, and I may just be reading into this, but I think Jesus maybe overheard them talking about this, and he decided to leverage this for a lesson, which is what a good teacher does. And so verse 6, he says, be careful, which is an imperative. And imperatives are in commands. This is a command. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now the disciples, when they heard this, they start thinking to themselves, oh no, we forgot the bread. And Jesus noticed that we forgot the bread. They were whispering among themselves maybe before, like, hey, Peter, did you get the bread? No, Andrew, I forgot. John, did you get the bread? No. And so suddenly they realize, Jesus realizes they don't have the bread, and they're thinking, Jesus is kind of upset about this. Here's what they said, verse 7, Matthew, who was present, he was one of the 12, says they discussed this among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. This is this big faux pas. Jesus found us out, and he's this is a big deal, and now he's upset, and he's bringing it up, and oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. We're supposed to be responsible for these things, and how could we have possibly forgotten? Now, I can only imagine what Jesus is thinking at this point in time, because he wasn't actually, as we're going to see, talking about physical bread, and that should have been obvious, but they're a little bit thick-headed, kind of like us sometimes. And so here's what happened, verse 8. Aware of their discussion, because Jesus knows everything, Jesus asked, you of little, what's that word? Faith. Which is kind of a funny thing to say. In fact, literally it would be like, you little faithers. You little faithers. Somebody, you who have no confidence. You who can't see beyond the present situation. He says, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? What are you doing? I mean, this doesn't even make sense. Now, faith, as we're going to see here and as we've talked about here as a church, faith is so important to Jesus. I mean, it is something that there are two things recorded in the Gospels that astonished Jesus. Two things. One was when people had big faith, and the other was when people had little faith. Those are the two things that amazed and astonished Jesus. And so he's looking at his disciples, the people, the men who should have known, the people who had spent time with him, who had experienced these miracles that he had performed, and yet they still had no faith. And he's frustrated. Why are you talking about the bread? Then he goes on, he says, do you still not understand? Have you not figured it out yet? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? He's like, loaves and fishes, guys. Loaves and fishes. Are you not aware? Have you not paid attention? Do you not realize what God has and what I have done in your presence? And I can, again, I mean, we're kind of reading the summary here, but I can just imagine Jesus is like, hey, Peter, you like to answer first. Why don't I ask you this question? Peter, when I fed all those people, do you remember how many loaves you had? 5 loaves, right? And we passed them around, and you had 3 fish. Remember that? And we passed them around. And Peter, could you just tell me how many baskets were left over? We talked about this last week. Anybody remember how many baskets were left over? 12. That's right, Peter. There were 12 baskets left over. 12 baskets, one for every one of you, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, one for every one of you. And Peter's like, yes, sir, there were 1 basket for each of us. So, Peter, let me ask you, do you really think I'm talking about bread? I mean, do you think that I'm incapable of providing bread for you right now in these moments if I want to? I mean, really? Is that honestly what you think? Why are you freaking out about bread? I want you little faithers to pay attention here. Do you not realize that I will provide for you? I mean, hasn't all these years, all these months that you've spent around me, hasn't it convinced you yet that I know what your needs are and I'm going to provide abundantly for them? Do you really think that I don't know what you need? And Jesus did something so fascinating here because he connected their concern with everyday needs with his ability and their confidence in him. He says, look, you've got to trust me, you little faithers. You've got to trust me. This is like discipleship 101, right? I mean, that's like the very first step. Okay, are you going to trust me? That's the very first step. So he says, look, don't you know I'll provide? So let's move off of this and let's get to what I was really talking about, because this is what I want to teach you. He continues on. He says, how is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Now, yeast in Jewish terms was used as a metaphor. And it was a metaphor for evil spreading and the potential of evil to spread to other people. Now you think about this, and you think about if you've ever baked bread before, and you use some yeast, and you put the yeast in the dough, and you mix it up with ingredients, and what's amazing is you take just a couple tablespoons of yeast, and it begins to infect everything, doesn't it? In fact, years ago, I had a roommate, his name was Wes. You guys, some of you have met Wes, he's spoken here before. And somebody gifted him with the curse of Amish friendship bread. Anybody know what Amish friendship bread is? It's actually very delicious bread, but it comes with it a little baggie of yeast and instructions. And for the next 2 weeks or so, you're supposed to add some ingredients to it. You squish it around every day. I mean, you're doing stuff to it, and then it multiplies. And it infects other bread, and it gets into this giant thing of dough. And what you're supposed to do is take out 7 or so baggies of dough or starter yeast that's supposedly been around for years and years and years. And then you bake 7 loaves of bread with whatever's left over, which is a massive amount. And then you gift somebody with a loaf of bread, a little baggie of yeast, and instructions for how their life is going to end, baking Amish friendship bread for the rest of their days, right? Because it never stops. It never stops. We had Amish friendship bread coming out our ears because he couldn't get rid of it fast enough. And you don't want to throw it out. So anyway, so the point is, yeast has this incredible potential to, John, can you pull me back? There's something going on with the microphone. Thanks. Sound system moving. Couple more weeks, we'll be upstairs. All right. Anyway, so the question is, okay, we get yeast, we understand what yeast is and what yeast does. What is the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? I'm glad you asked that question, because I'll answer it. Here we go. Verse 12, he says, then, and again, this is Matthew talking. Matthew was present for this. He says, then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread. Duh. No. It had nothing to do with physical bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, this is so important because the Pharisees and the Sadducees were kind of unique people, and they didn't agree on a lot. In fact, one of the only things they agreed on was that they hated Jesus and they wanted to get rid of him, and they ended up crucifying him. That was about the only thing they agreed on. So what is this yeast that they had? What was the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Now, we've talked about this before, but in case you're new with us, the Pharisees loved their laws. They loved having laws to abide by. There was the written law from Moses. There was an oral law that some believe was elevated above the written law, and that the oral law, people had to obey this. There were 613 written laws that everybody had to obey. But the Pharisees loved trying to earn their relationship with God. It was like check boxes. If I check this box, God will be happy with me. I'll earn it. God will be happy with me, and then he'll have to give me what it is that I want him to give me. And they would find ways of loopholes of kind of getting around what they thought God cared about as check boxes. One of those involved the 10 Commandments. There's a commandment about honor your father and mother. And so the Pharisees, what they would do is, as their parents would get old, they would realize they needed somebody to help care for them, and the Pharisees didn't want to give their money to their parents, so they would dedicate their money instead to God. And in the process, it was called Corban. And so their older, elderly, parents who needed financial assistance, the Pharisees would just say, well, I'm sorry, my money is Corban. It's dedicated to God and to his purposes, and I can't use it to help you. And so they would live off of this money, and then when they died, it would go to the temple. But it was a loophole that they found of not honoring your father and mother, but still kind of checking the box, so it looked like we were doing a good thing, that God should be happy with us because we've dedicated all this to him. Forget the fact that we just, spit in the face of our parents. And the Pharisees were so good at doing this, which is kind of silly because Jesus looked at that and he said, you're a bunch of whitewashed tombs. Do you honestly think God just cares how you look on the outside? That's what a whitewashed tomb is. It looks pretty on the outside, but it's dead and rotten on the inside. I mean, for those of you in the room who are parents, with your children, do you want them to just obey on the outside? Meanwhile, there's rebellion on the inside. Is that what you hope for your children? That when they're not in your presence, they do whatever they want, but on the outside, they look nice and pretty? Is that really what you want for your kids? That's not what I want. I don't make rules so that they can obey my rules. I make rules because I care about their hearts, and I care about what's going on their inside, and I want them to grow up and be, useful people to society. I want them to have a love for God and a love for Jesus and a trust in him. I want to develop something inside of them. But the Pharisees were convinced that we earn our relationship with God by obeying the rules and the laws. Now, the Sadducees were a little different. In fact, they didn't really even believe that God had many interactions with people anymore. They didn't believe in heaven. They didn't believe in hell, which is why they were sad, you see. I know. Thank you for pretending to laugh, those of you who have heard me say that before. But they kind of believed in something that's almost along the lines of karma, where the good that I experience in life is because of the good that I've done, the bad I experience in life is along the lines of the bad I've done. In other words, I earn whatever it is that I get. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, because there are Christians today who honestly adhere to both of those. There are churches that are really focused on the external laws and obeying, and you have to dress a certain way and talk a certain way and cut your hair a certain way and look a certain way. And there are also Christians who believe in karma and what goes around and comes around. But here's why both of those are the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because both of those move us away from grace. Do you know what grace is? It is receiving the very thing we do not deserve. It's God's unmerited kindness, his incredible love for us that was sent down in the person of Jesus. I couldn't earn it. I don't deserve it. Still, he gave himself away. It's this beautiful thing that Jesus came to demonstrate in such a remarkable way. You can't earn this. You can simply receive it. Now, there's a Latin word, it's the word gratis, and it's what we translate into the word grateful, and it's very closely linked to the Latin word great, which is grace. It is nothing that we can earn, it is simply something we receive. See, this is why when we complain, we move away from grace. We move away from gratitude, and in doing so, we move away from grace, and in moving away from grace, we move away from God. That's why when we complain, all of a sudden it's, I deserved something different. Something different was owed to me. Rather than simply being grateful for what it is that we've received, we move away from the gift that is so generously given to us. And we miss the opportunity to receive what God wants to give us, which is why we've got to be so careful. We've got to beware of what moves us away from grace. That's what was so damaging. That was the yeast that was spreading this evil that was moving people away from the gift that God so generously was giving the people in the person of Jesus. And not just the people, giving to you, giving to me. But when we complain about things like the weather, right? I've complained about the weather all the time. I complained that they predicted 2 inches of snow yesterday and we got nothing. I was kind of disappointed about that. Others of you were complaining that we had snow a couple weeks ago. And then we're all complaining that you can be 25% right and still have a job, right? I mean, how is it that weathermen are able to do that? We complain about sports. I mean, good grief, the Patriots. Who doesn't complain about sports? I mean, and the coaches and the teams, and we complain about the news. We complain about everything. I mean, there are so many things. We complain about the schools. We complain about the technology, I do anyway. We complain about the amount of homework. We complain about bullying. We complain about, not enough vacation time. We complain about our government. We complain about all kinds of stuff. And yet in doing so, we forget all that we've been given, all that we've received. Do you know the antidote to contagious complaining? It's intentional gratitude. The antidote to contagious complaining, because it spreads like yeast. The antidote to contagious complaining is intentional gratitude. It's making a decision to say, I am going to choose to be grateful. Now, there are times that's hard because you may be in an environment where there's all kinds of contagious complaining around the water cooler at work or the lunch table or in the break room, and you've got to make a decision and say, you know what, I've got to avoid this environment because it's just moving my heart in a direction toward complaining. There are times when we have to just stop ourselves. I'll tell you what, this series has been healthy for me because in the midst of finding all kinds of things to complain about, I'm like the chief complainer, it's been a challenge for me to say, okay, what good can I see in this and how can I express gratitude in the midst of something that's frustrating to me? And when I do that, I move myself in the direction of what God has for me, but this is not something that comes natural. Right? I mean, those of you who have kids coming up, Christmas time, and people are going to give gifts to your kids. And what do you say to your kids when they receive a gift? You say to them, what do you say? You say thank you, right? I mean, we have to teach this to our children, which means it's not natural, which means we've got to teach it to ourselves too. And it becomes an intentional process. And I'm telling you, when we do that, and thankfully we have the gift of the Spirit of God living inside of us to help us do that, it's when we do that we open ourselves up into seeing what God is doing in our midst on a daily basis. We open ourselves up to grace. That's why when we began this series, I sent you all home with a jar and a pad of paper. It was kind of sneaky. I was trying to develop a habit in you, a spiritual habit of being grateful. Because it isn't something that comes naturally, but when we move in the direction of gratitude, it does something in our hearts. And it moves us toward receiving the very thing that God wants to give us, grace. Grace. Grace, did you know he wants to give that to you? But it requires humility. In order to receive something, you have to humbly accept it. And it begins with the process and the habit of gratitude. When's the last time you gave thanks to God, when you expressed gratitude to God for all that you have? I hope through this series you've been prompted to do that a little bit. When's the last time you gave thanks to God for your job, for indoor plumbing, for medical care, for family, for having a roof over your heads, for Jesus, sending Jesus down so that we could receive grace? When's the last time? It's a spiritual practice, and when you practice it, God does something in you. When's the last time you expressed your gratitude to other people? Maybe to a spouse or to your kids. There are so many things that we take for granted in our lives. When's the last time you expressed gratitude for somebody making dinner or cleaning the house or mowing the lawn, doing the laundry, or your kids for what they do at school and working hard? And you may say, well, they know I'm grateful, do they? And even if they know, you're not doing it just for them, you're doing it for you. You're doing it for you because it does something inside of you. When's the last time you said thank you to your employer, the person that you work for, and thanked them for the opportunity and for the privilege of having a place to come and earn money? And you may say, well, they don't pay me enough. Yeah, but you got a job, right? There are people without jobs, and you've got one. When's the last time you said thank you? And again, it's not just for them. Sometimes it's for you. It's to do something in you. When's the last time you gave thanks and expressed gratitude for those you employ? And you may think, well, I don't really employ anybody, but the truth is you do. When you go to a restaurant and there's a server, you're employing that person. Have you ever said thank you or written a thank you note to a server at a restaurant? Or a bank teller or a doctor or nurse or whoever it is that you interact with? When's the last time you expressed gratitude, genuine gratitude? What about for our church? I mean, we have workers, those of you who have kids, we have workers who are investing into the hearts of your children every week. They come early, they do extra work throughout the week so that you can have a time here to grow. When is the last time you expressed genuine gratitude? I am so thankful for those of you who invest into the lives of my children in ways that I can't personally always do. What a blessing. I'm so thankful. I'm so grateful. When's the last time you expressed gratitude to our tech team who's put up with all kinds of garbage with sound systems and what? Or to our guest services team, to Ann who helps organize all that, to our refuel leaders, to Abby with that. I mean, we have so much to be thankful for. And when we learn to express it, it is a spiritual practice that does something inside of us. And you know what? As much as our complaining can be contagious, did you know that our expressions of gratitude can be contagious too? And that we can begin moving the hearts of other people in the direction of God's grace. You know, my biggest prayer for our church is that we would be a people of sincere gratitude. We don't have to be here. God didn't have to give us this place. But he did. He didn't have to give us air to breathe. He didn't have to give us beautiful trees that change colors in the fall and flower in the spring. He didn't have to give us snow that is so pretty when it falls. But he did. But he did. And so we can choose to be grateful. And when we do, I'm telling you, God works through that. And you begin experiencing something you didn't know you could experience. His incredible grace. So this Thanksgiving, I hope it doesn't end. I hope it continues on into the new year. We have so much to be grateful for. Would you join me in expressing that gratitude in a tangible, real way to people, to God, to others, so that we can all be recipients and experience God's incredible grace? Let me pray for us. God, I just thank you so much for this season to refocus our hearts, to refocus our minds. God, I thank you for the incredible grace that came down in the person of Jesus. Lord, I ask that you would allow that to lead us to be grateful. Father, I know it's not a natural sort of thing. It's certainly not natural for me. My guess is for most of us, it's not natural. I pray that you would help us to have the intentional practice in our lives of expressing gratitude and in doing so, experiencing what you have for us. Lord, thank you so much for again this season. Let us be grateful and let that gratitude spread into the lives of others. We thank you and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.